anything with regard to Trump. Don't go to see him. Do not retaliate and do not go begging for a trade deal. An American president has blown up the American designed and constructed global financial and trading system.
Yanis Varoufakis states a harsh reality. Europe has missed the technological revolution. For the last 20 years, a chronic lack of investment has left the continent strategically vulnerable, especially to the United States. In this analysis, he explains why Europe's threats are no longer credible. To grasp the full picture of this decline, make sure you're subscribed.
It's even worse than that. They are trying to subordinate themselves to a ruler, Trump, who doesn't want them as subordinates. They are begging, let us be your slaves. And he says, no, I don't want you to be my slaves. So it's pretty comical, really. Look, the reason why we have fallen behind the technologies of the future, which are what? Green energy, which is solar panels and wind power and fusion, is because we haven't invested anything. Germany used to be the top-notch producer of solar panels in the year 2000, right? And what happened? They stopped investing it. The Chinese have overtaken them by 2 industrial revolutions, not just one. They are 2 industrial revolutions ahead of European manufacturers of solar panels. Similarly with electric vehicles. This idiocy that the Chinese are dumping cheap products because of the Chinese government's subsidies. This is all rubbish. They simply have technologies that we don't have in the European Union. Why? Because they have invested. We spent the last 20 years not investing. And the chickens come home to roost at some point. When you miss out 20 years of investment at the time of a technological revolution, that's it. You're done. And what they have done instead of investing is regulating. They, in their immense inanity, they thought that, well, okay, we don't invest, but we are a 500 million strong economy, which is true. And because of our heft, because of our magnitude, of our size, we're going to regulate. We are going to impose our own standards on the rest of the world. Well, it doesn't work for very long, that policy. If you don't have any cloud capital, as I call the capital that lives in the cloud, then at some point, the cloud capital is going to overtake your own regulations. You heard the talk in town in Brussels that, if Trump imposes these awful tariffs on our goods, on our cars and this and that and our aluminium, and our Hermes bags and Louis Vuitton and so on, then we are going to slap digital taxes on big tech, Silicon Valley. Well, by the way, I'm totally in favor of taxes on big tech. I call it a cloud tax. I've argued in favor of it. But you know what? They won't even do that because they are all full of hot air. And they won't do it because of one. Unlike the Chinese that have developed their own big tech, for every single large big tech company in America, there is an equivalent in China, which is actually better than the American one in terms of the functionality of, Baidu, of Tencent, of Bilibili, of Alibaba. And if you compare, technically, they're better. They're actually better than the American ones. Okay, we have nothing. We have nothing in Europe, and what we have is we sell it off. Volt was sold off to American Silicon Valley. So. If I have no doubt that if they try to, if Brussels tries to retaliate to the U.S. tariffs on European goods with a large cloud tax for big tech will blackmail Europe, very simply saying we will cut off all services to you Europeans. And then what will Ursula von der Leyen tell Europeans? You don't have access to YouTube. You don't have access to X. The Americans can easily do this for a few months. It will only take 1 week of cutting Europeans off YouTube before the whole of the Commission collapses. So these are all non-credible threats in our economic language. The US objective is the same since the Second World War, and that's global hegemony. The United States exited the Second World War, having inherited essentially the British Empire after the British Empire went bankrupt. The Truman Doctrine went hand in hand with the Bretton Woods system. So essentially, it was all about maintaining the very intense production of American manufacturing after 1945. Their great fear at the time was that with the war ending and the necessity of producing at more than 100% of capacity, essentially the United States faced the serious threat of going back to 1929, to a great recession, a great depression. And the way to stop that was to ensure that the United States would be a net exporter. It was the same model, if you want, as that of China today. But they were nuanced enough and smart enough to understand that you can't maintain net exports forever unless you transfer part of your surpluses to the deficit regions of your global economic system in order to maintain the demand for your net exports. So Europe and Japan were dollarized, either through the Marshall Aid Plan or credits or loans that were private or public, didn't matter. I mean, there was a large chunk of American surpluses that were being sent to Europe and to Asia so that they could maintain the net exports of the United States. This was the Bretton Woods system. That system was bound to die once the United States no longer had the surplus. And that's when the Trump of that time, a gentleman that you will remember as Richard Nixon, blew up the monetary system and the world trading system that the Americans had created. So it's, what Trump is doing has been done before. An American president has blown up the American designed and constructed global financial and trading system. And the result was a period from the mid-1970s onwards of an inverted global recycling mechanism. Instead of American surpluses being recycled to the rest of the world, American deficits provided the massive aggregate demand which was necessary for the German economic miracle to continue, for the Japanese economic miracle to continue, then for the Chinese economic miracle to take root and to grow. So to put it very vulgarly, but I think in a manner which is not misleading, essentially the American economy was producing aggregate demand for the German, the Japanese, and the Chinese exporters. They were being paid in IOUs called dollars, and those dollars went back to the United States through Wall Street to finance the American government, the American stock exchange, and American real estate. That was the situation. And of course, that tsunami of capital that was going into Wall Street required the deregulation of Wall Street. The bankers went berserk. They started building huge, gigantic piles of toxic derivatives on top of that. And that collapsed in 2008. And that whole system enters a very serious crisis. This very weird recycling system. And, the combination of socialism for the bankers, that's quantitative easing, money printing for the bankers, and austerity for almost everybody else, the vast majority, that created a very significant collapse in investment in the United States, in Europe. The only people who actually invested a lot of the money that was being printed by the central banks were the big tech owners. The Amazons and the Googles and the Metas and so on. That's why we have a new form of capital. I call it cloud capital, which doesn't produce anything except power to extract rents from the rest of the economy. And in this context, with the United States being utterly decimated in terms of the deindustrialization process, because the American rentier class was doing really very well. People who lived off the financial markets and real estate did brilliantly with all this recycling of other people's money or profits that the United States trade deficit maintained. But if you were a construction worker or a manufacturing, blue-collar worker in the Midwest, you were decimated. And then Trump comes along and says, well, that can't continue. We overdid it. And I'm going to make America great again. In other words, I'm going to rebalance the disproportionate relationship between the dollar world and the American manufacturing capacity, which became totally disproportionate. To put it differently, American finance, the dollarized world, became a gigantic parasite that was parasitic on a tiny little organism, American manufacturing, which was shrinking. Now, that doesn't mean that what Trump is promising he's going to accomplish. It doesn't mean that because Nixon was successful with his shock, that Trump will be successful with his shock. It doesn't mean that there's going to be the continuity, because it's not just a question of what Trump does. For this project to work, the next administration and the one after that will have also to participate. Nixon didn't do it on his own. Carter and Reagan and then Bush continued that policy. So we're living in very interesting times. Well, not much is the answer. Whatever it is they are doing it in a state of panic without any planning. There is, look, the world that the Nixon shock created was the world that begat the euro, the Eurozone. Because come to think of it, what Nixon did in 1971 was to expel Europe from the dollar zone. Up until 1971, we had fixed exchange rates with the dollar. Okay? In other words, we had the dollar. We were part of the dollar zone, even though we had our own national currencies in our pockets. Think about it. For 30 years, 20 years, we didn't have to check the exchange rates because they were the same. Interest rates were more or less, between 4 and 5% constant. It was a magnificently boring world. It was a world in which the German manufacturing machine became so substantially successful. And what the Americans did in 1971 was to chuck us out. They threw us out, effectively, to the wolves. Remember the US Treasury Secretary who visited on behalf of Richard Nixon, the Europeans, in 1971, John Connolly, who went around and said, I don't care what your problem is, mate. The dollar is our currency, but it is your problem. And in a state of complete panic back in the 70s, the Europeans started they started attempting to create their own Bretton Woods system, their own fixed exchange rate regime. The reason why they needed it is because the European Union, Glenn, was constructed like a cartel of big business. I mean, the first name was the European Communities of Coal and Steel. So it was like what OPEC does with oil. They wanted to do it with coal and steel. That is to limit competition, to have steady prices, agreed prices, cartel prices. And then, of course, they brought in the farmers with the Treaty of Rome, to whom they offered a chunk of the profits of heavy industry. That's what a common agricultural policy is. Now, for a cartel to work, as we know from OPEC, they need to have a common currency or fixed exchange rates. Because if the exchange rates fluctuate, it's really very hard to keep the collusion going. Because in a cartel, as we all know, and our students know from Economics 101, cartels are unstable. They are centrifugal forces. And if you allow for prices to vary because exchange rates vary, then you can't maintain the cartel. So Europe needed that construction, cartel-like construction of the European Union required a common currency. So we went into this process of, first it was the snake, if you remember, then it was the European monetary system, then it was the exchange rate mechanism. Everything we did failed. And so we decided we will federate our money, create a common money, the euro. But in the process, we forgot to create a common treasury. We forgot to create the democratic institutions that can manage the monetary policies in a way that is remotely democratic. The result, of course, was the euro crisis. And how did they deal with the euro crisis? By means of unbelievably harsh austerity and a lot of money printing, which of course meant that Volkswagen didn't invest anything. Because if they get all of this free money and the customers don't have money to buy expensive Volkswagens or Tesla-like machines, new generation cars, then they don't invest it out. They take the money that the ECB printed, they go to the Frankfurt Stock Exchange and they buy their own shares back. The share price goes up. The directors of Volkswagen make a mint because their salaries are linked to the share price. And for 15 years, we had no investment. Meanwhile, the politics becomes toxified because when you are applying austerity on the German people, the French people, the Greek people, and so on, so now everybody hates everyone. You go to Europeans, even progressive Europeans, and you say to them, how about we federate now? They say, go away. Just go away. Just don't tell me about this. People that wanted a European federation some time ago. Right? So the politics has become toxic. There is no coordination. We have no leadership. And once upon a time, I'm famously opposed to somebody like Angela Merkel, right? But at least she was a leader. At least she had political capital. Now we have headless chickens running around, like, this guy Merz, who failed even to get elected first time around as Chancellor of Germany. We have Macron, lame duck. When I was in government, there was a very severe clash between the North and the South. Now we have an even worse clash between the East and the West. Why am I telling you all this? Forgive my long-winded answer, but your question is, how is Europe responding to the Trump shock? Well, it's not, because to respond, you need to have a coherent political decision-making center, and we don't. You have Merz, who wants a free trade agreement with Trump. That's falling right into the trap that Donald Trump is setting up. You have Macron, who doesn't want that, who wants something else. And neither Merz nor Macron have any power over the European Commission. You have Ursula von der Leyen, that has created a tiny little cabal around herself. She has no legitimacy, no democratic support from anyone. She's concentrating power for herself, doing really idiotic things that have absolutely no connection with the real problem that Europe has, which is, we are missing something like 600 billion a year in terms of investment. We have an investment shortfall of 600 billion a year, and nobody's talking about that. And when they do, I don't have much hair, but the little hair I have, I pull it out, because they are talking about military engines. They're going to buy tanks and torpedoes, and I don't know what other idiotic ideas they have as to what they're going to purchase. This is not going to bring about growth. It will grow the share prices of Rheinmetall and Alstom and so on, but it's not going to do anything macroeconomically significantly for Europe. So the short version of the answer to your question is that Europe is falling behind. The Chinese are the adults in the room. They're the ones who are responding in a very conservative, rational, sensible manner. And they have a plan. And the Europeans don't have a plan. And the plan which we primarily lack is a macroeconomic and an investment plan. That's the only thing we don't have. Everything, all sorts of other plans we have about regulations, about so what we really need, we don't have. And we're not even working towards having it. So allow me to say that three things that should have been done yesterday, but at least let's do them today. But I don't think they will be done. But let me tell you what they are. Well, firstly, don't do anything with regard to Trump. Don't go to see him. Do not retaliate, and do not go begging for a trade deal. Just ignore him. Instead, open a communication line with Beijing. I'm not saying that we should become vassals of Beijing in the same way that we were vassals of the United States. No, but coordinate. Firstly, do away with all of the tariffs that the European Union imposed on China at the behest of the United States. There were, those tariffs on solar panels, for instance, were imposed upon us by Washington. Washington called up Brussels and said, you put these tariffs on the Chinese because we're at war with the Chinese. Well, the Americans are at war with us. Why should we be at war with the Chinese because the Americans are at war? We need solar panels. They make really good solar panels very cheaply, right? So let's actually buy them without making our own people in Europe pay through the nose for something that we actually need, right? Point number one, do away with the tariffs that were imposed by Europe on behalf of the United States. Secondly, coordinate between the European Central Bank and the Central Bank of China a common stimulus program, because both China and the European Union, we need a coordinated stimulus in order to fend off the recessionary waves that are coming our way as a result of the impact of Trump's tariffs on world trade. Thirdly, find ways of collaborating on joint production. We've done this before. It was Siemens and Alstom who went to China and helped them build railways, which are now much better than ours. Okay, why don't we have the same thing? Why don't we have joint ventures between Volkswagen and BYD to produce electric cars in Germany, for instance? So that's the first thing I would do. The second thing I would do is move straight into an investment program that will plug the investment gap that I mentioned before of about 600, 700 billion every year. And the way to do it, don't do it through a silly recovery fund like the one we created during the pandemic, which was a terrible idea, because essentially what it did was it taxed poor German workers to give money to oligarchs in Italy and to Greece, to put it very, very succinctly and poignantly. That's what it was. And it was like telling the German people and the Dutch people, never again with these Greeks and the Italians. But what we do need is a pan-European investment program, which doesn't fund government, but it funds particular projects that are potentially profitable, wherever it might be, in the south of Greece, of Europe, in the north of Europe, and so on. And we know that we need about 600 to 700 billion for that. Now, there's no time to have this discussion about Eurobonds and a federal treasury, because, as I said before, this discussion has been poisoned a long time ago. But we have the European Investment Bank, which issues bonds. Well, give them a green light to issue 600 billion euros worth of bonds every year for the next 5 years, let's say, and have the European Central Bank declare that if needs be, it will step in the secondary markets and buy them, which means that the ECB, the EIB bonds that I'm proposing are going to have interest rates of less than 2%, maybe less than 1%. Because they will be so safe if they have the ECB behind them. And you take this 600, 700 and you throw it into the technologies that we are so lacking. And you do it at a pan-European level. You don't even do it through the governments. You do it through, a European program for investment, like the Marshall Aid Plan was an American program for investment. So that's the second thing I would do. And the third thing I would do is I would create a digital wallet at the ECB for every European citizen. You can download it from the Android or the Apple Store or whatever, like the Chinese can, because the Central Bank of China has provided the Chinese with a free digital bank account. What you get is any money you have there on that wallet collects the overnight rate of the central bank, which is magnificent, a fantastic way of competing with awful commercial banks that underpay their savers and overcharge their borrowers. And suddenly you have this amazing new digital realm of free payments, cross-border payments. That's how you compete with the Chinese WeChat, with the Chinese digital currency. That's how you force upon bankers. Essentially, you say to them, you no longer have the monopoly of the payment system. You want to provide good services to customers, do it.
It is imperative that we do not place China and Russia in the same basket. They're very different kettles of fish, very different. The collapse of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, which was very painful for people like me, primarily because the working class of the Soviet Union did not rise up to defend a system which supposedly gave predominance to the working class, which means that it never really did give predominance to the working class. And the result was that essentially you had regime change. You had the United States directing the wholesale privatization of the Soviet economy, which meant that within days it became an ironclad oligarchy. Because when you give pieces of paper, little shares for every corporation that was the Chubais plan, essentially giving tiny little portions of the ownership of the means of production to the people who are starving, who can't put food on the table, they will sell those pieces of paper to the highest bidder. So in the end, 10 oligarchs bought the whole of the former Soviet or Russian economy. And you have effectively an industrial feudalism. An oligarchy that was particularly fascistic in its behavior. You had the rise of Putin, and you had the massacres of the Chechens. You had a society where average life expectancy for men dropped from 77 years to 53. That has never happened even during the Second World War. So that's Russia. China is totally different. There was no regime change in China. yes, you're completely right. I would suffocate in a regime where I cannot express my views. I cannot criticize the government. I can't criticize the president without fearing that, that will disappear overnight. That, to me, as a radical Democrat, is unacceptable. But at the same time, China is a remarkable experiment in progress. I've been there a number of times, and what I see makes me very optimistic. Not fully optimistic, but compared to other places, I think that it is quite fascinating. On the one hand, you are completely right. You have unacceptable limits on free speech. You have authoritarianism. You have people languishing in prison because of their beliefs. Totally unacceptable stuff. But at the same time, if you go into any municipality in Shanghai, in Shenzhen, in Guangzhou, in Beijing, you enter the municipality building, which, I mean, in these huge cities, the building is very large, believe me. And on the first floor, there are all these conference rooms, and you see there boisterous debates happening between citizen assemblies, within citizen assemblies. So there is a absolute
payment system that I mentioned. The banks of Frankfurt and the banks of Paris are going to decapitate any politician who suggests that, because essentially you are taking away their monopoly over the payment system. When I proposed that in 2015. I was not only demonized, I was, as I said, discursively decapitated. All sorts of rubbish was being published all over the place, sponsored by bankers who really wanted to bring me down, to annul me as an entity, because it's a lot of money for them. When it comes to organizing creating this investment program, look, my view on this is that the German financial industrial establishment has not acquiesced to the euro yet. We've had the euro since 1992, almost, since the Maastricht Treaty, right? But they have not really accepted it. They have accepted, but they want to maintain their right and opportunity to leave the euro. That is the German establishment. They've allowed us to use their Deutschmark in the form of the euro, but they want to be able to pull the plug and get out, which means they can't have this much common debt. So the reason why they say no to common debt, which means they can't have a common investment program, is the right for Germany to get out of Europe. Even by the staunchest of Europeans who don't want to get out of Europe, because they understand, and this is not an irrational idea on their part, that the way to have maximum influence within Europe is to have an exit strategy, right? When the Italians and the French don't, because they are deficit countries. That's what gives them more power than the deficit countries. But the moment you're locked into common debt, it's the reason why California cannot leave the dollar union, because it's impossible to know which part of the American sovereign debt corresponds to California. So there you are. This is my psychoanalysis, if you want, of the reasons why they're not doing which deep down they also know needs to be done.
Yanis Varoufakis points out that Europe's chronic lack of unified investment and strategic vision is causing it to fall behind China and the US. What do you think is the main reason for this stagnation? Let's discuss in the comments. If you find these analyses valuable, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated.